Hi everybody, it's Miss Kelly and I am here today to talk to you about poetry, and we're going to be doing a series of a few little short videos here to learn more about poetry. And poetry is one of my favorite things to teach, and it's also one of my favorite things to learn about and to read. So I hope you enjoy poetry as much as I do. So before we get into poetry today, we're going to start out by talking about what a poem actually is. What is poetry? And by definition, poetry is a type of writing in which the author uses figurative language, imagery, style, and rhythm to create meaning and invoke emotion in the reader. Now, you may remember when we learned about figurative language, okay? So you're going to notice that a lot of poems include figurative language and imagery, right? Giving our mind that complete picture of what's happening so that we have a better understanding of it. And invoke emotion means to bring emotions out in you, to make you feel something. And that is what a lot of poets want to do. They want you to have an emotion when you read their poem. A poem is created by putting words together in an interesting way to express a feeling, create a mental image or picture, tell a story, or make a sound. Poetry entertains the ears and sometimes even the eyes. So we're going to later on look at some poems that are written in a really neat way that appeals to the eye as well. So here are some examples of different types of poems, and I think you'll notice that they all look really different, don't they? Right? We have this kind of poem where it actually has the word down and it's going down. Here we have wide streets and the letters are spaced far apart. Big people and the letters are all in capitals. You might recognize this kind of poem. This is an acrostic poem where there's a word going down, and then next to each letter there's another word or a line that has something to do with the word going down. This poem here, it kind of gets bigger as it goes down. It starts shorter at the top and then gets bigger towards the bottom. Here's a poem that's 2 lines, and you might be familiar with this. Is called a cinquain, and that is a 5-line poem, and it sort of has a pattern to it. And we'll talk about that later. But poems can be very, very different looking. There's no set pattern or formula to write a poem. So what you'll notice is that poems look and sound and feel very different from each other. So as we're learning about poems, we are going to start by talking about some features of poems, okay? And features are things that poems have in common. So in order to understand a poem, you have to understand the features that the poet uses. So in order to do this, we're going to look at a poem called Toboggan by American poet Benjamin Franklin King. And this poem was written in the mid-1800s. So what we have here is what's called an excerpt, and an excerpt is only part of the poem. It's not the whole thing. So we're not going to read the whole poem. We're just going to read a part of it. So here's an excerpt from the poem Toboggan by Benjamin Franklin King. And for those of you that might be wondering, what is a toboggan? A toboggan is a type of sled. We don't hear that word very often, but it is sort of an old-fashioned word for a sled. Down from the hills and over the snow, swift as a meteor's flash we go, toboggan, toboggan, toboggan. Down from the hills with our senses lost, jealous of cheeks that are kissed by the frost, toboggan, toboggan, toboggan. Now, before we look at the features of this poem, I just want to point out, and some of you may have noticed it, we have some examples of figurative language. Right here we have swift as a meteor's flash we go. That is a simile, right? Because we're using the word like or as to compare the toboggan, right, to a meteor, right? They're going fast, so they're saying swift as a meteor's flash. And then down here, jealous of cheeks that are kissed by the frost, right? That is personification, right? The frost is kissing the cheeks, right? We know that frost is not a person. It can't kiss anybody, but they are using personification to sort of give the frost the idea that the frost is sort of touching or kissing the person's cheek. So the first feature of poetry is what's called a stanza. So instead of having a paragraph like a story might, poetry has what are called stanzas. And they are groups of lines in a poem. And you can usually tell them because the lines are grouped together and there may be a bigger space in between stanzas. So as you're looking at this toboggan poem, you see that these 3 lines are sort of together in a group. That is a stanza. Then these 3 lines are together in a group. That is a stanza. So here we have stanza 1 and stanza 2. So if we're looking at this poem, this excerpt from Toboggan, we would say that it has 2 stanzas. Now, rhyme scheme, and I'm sure you know what rhyming means, words that sound alike. Rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhymes in a poem. So not all poems rhyme, right? But some do. So poems that do rhyme have what we call a rhyme scheme. And they usually follow a pattern, okay? And if we're looking at the rhyme scheme and we want to break it down to figure out what the pattern is, we'll label it with capital letters A, B, C, D, and so on. So if we look at the first stanza of Toboggan, down from the hills and over the snow, swift as a meteor's flash we go, toboggan, toboggan, toboggan. The first 2 lines rhyme, so we would give them the letter A. So that would be A. This 3rd line does not rhyme. So we're going to give this a B because it doesn't rhyme with the A's. It doesn't rhyme with snow and go. So this rhyme scheme would be A, B. And in the second stanza, down from the hills with our senses lost, jealous of cheeks that are kissed by the frost, toboggan, toboggan, toboggan. Again, the first 2 lines rhyme. So we have A. And that 3rd line does not rhyme. Toboggan does not rhyme with frost and lost. So the rhyme scheme would be, again, A, B. So you would look at each stanza separately for the rhyme scheme. And here's how they would break it up. A, B, A, B. So the A's rhyme and the B does not rhyme. Now, a refrain is a line that is repeated throughout a poem. So you might think of the refrain like a chorus in a song, right? That part of the song that is sung a few times. So in this poem, the line toboggan, toboggan, toboggan is repeated, right? We see it in the first stanza. We see it again in the second stanza. So that would be what we would call the refrain. Okay, so there it is. Refrain is in the first stanza and it appears again in the second stanza. And I'm not sure, we don't have this whole poem in front of us, but we could take a guess and say this line, toboggan, 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 probably appears in other stanzas as well. Now, you may hear the word verse when you are talking about a poem or learning about a poem, and a verse can be a word that can mean a single line of poetry. It can mean an entire stanza. It can even mean an entire poem. So verse has several different meanings. And here is an example of a poem or a verse that, we could call this a poem, we could call this a verse. Now, there are some poems that do not rhyme. They don't have any rhythm. There's no pattern to them. And we call those types of poems free verse. There is no pattern to them. And this poem here is a poem that is a great example of free verse because it doesn't rhyme. There's no rhythm. The stanzas have different lengths. They're not the same amount of lines. So let's take a look at it. This poem is called Fog by Carl Sandburg. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over the harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So the poet is sort of invoking that feeling that the fog is sort of creeping in, right? It creeps in silently to the city, right? It stays there for a little while. And then, in the morning, the fog kind of rolls in and then it rolls out again. But I think it's a really neat poem because it's short. It conveys an emotion. We get a good image in our mind. And it's free verse. It doesn't have any rhyme or rhythm. So it shows us that a poem does not have to have rhymes to be a great poem. So let's review. The features of a poem that we want to remember are the stanza, which is a group of lines in a poem similar to a paragraph, the rhyme scheme, which is the pattern of rhymes in a poem. And remember, that uses those capital letters A, B for each stanza for the lines that rhyme. And the refrain. And the refrain is a line that is repeated throughout a poem. And that's sort of like the chorus in a song that you would sing over and over again. So I hope this was helpful. And next time, we're going to look at some different types of poems. So I hope this is helpful for you, and I will see you again soon. Bye.